awesome guy. We're so thrilled. I am so thrilled to have him here. Dan Yashinsky, come on up with your story, the worst listener in the world.
We're sitting around a campfire at Bolton Camp. Some of you might remember Bolton Camp. It was a family service camp for the poorest kids in the whole city. Anybody ever go to Bolton Camp? Bolton campers, camp counselors? No? So here we are around the campfire, and I was a camp counselor. I had never worked with kids before, so this was a big revelation. And I had a cabin full of really crazy 8-year-old boys. So first night, campfire, counselors made a nice fire, and all the kids are sitting on their logs, and I'm sitting with them. And we always began with a song. And here's what happened for me. I'm sitting around the fire just with those other kids, with the kids. I'm a counselor. I actually was I just moved to Canada from California. I'd been demonstrating against the Vietnam War. I'd been in jail in Santa Barbara, California, and now I was trying to deal with these 8-year-old boys, which was much harder than being in jail. And I thought this was the most wonderful thing I'd ever seen. Not the ghost story, axe murderer stuff, the way they listened. Because my crazy little boys never listened to anything at all, except the stories that were told around that campfire. So I decided I had to learn this particular form of magic called storytelling. This was something really interesting to me. So on my days off, I used to go down to Boys and Girls House Library. Anybody remember 40 St. George Street? Yeah, and I would come back with all these books of folk tales and fairy tales. And then I would read them aloud until one night I decided I was going to learn a story in my head and tell it to the boys. And this was really, and I have a terrible memory, and I'm kind of shy anyway, so it was a big challenge. But I picked a beautiful story called The Firebird. Some of you know like Stravinsky, beautiful piece of music. But anyway, it's a beautiful Russian fairy tale, The Firebird. And I learned this story. I learned it in my head. I was really excited. I was going to tell my boys the story at night. But it didn't go well. And I'll tell you what happened. So I gave them their snacks, and they're all in their bunks, and little Frankie's up there on the top bunk. And I lit a candle, make a little atmosphere, and I started the story. And it started like this. Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen. They had 3 sons. And one day the king went blind. And he called his sons and he said, "You must find a cure for my blindness." And the first 2 sons galloped off on their quest. But the 3rd son, like the youngest prince, looked at his father and he said, and this is where Frankie decided to do something very inappropriate, because he was the worst listener in the world. He was up on his upper bunk, he said, and the 3rd prince opened his mouth and he said, and here's Frankie, he went, he didn't have a mic, but it sounded pretty loud in the cabin. Now, I didn't know anything really about working with kids, and those of you who are teachers, you probably know that there are lots of ways to deal with a kid who misbehaves. For one thing, you should probably just ignore it and go away. So that's what I thought. All right, I'll try to ignore this misbehavior. I will continue my story. So I got back into the story, and I was mad, though, because this was my world premiere. This is the first time I ever told a story, and those shitty little kids making fart noises. But I stayed calm. I tried to find my serenity, as our storyteller earlier said, and tell my story. The 3rd son looked at his father and he said, "Daddy, I don't want to go on a quest. I'm tired." And that's true in every fairy tale. The real hero never goes off, like Dudley Do-Right on the big... Did I just date myself? The Mountie, right? He never does, or she never does. The 3rd son, the 3rd daughter always just goes for a nap or something, and that's exactly what happened in my story. The 3rd prince said, I don't want to go on a quest today. I'm kind of tired. So he went off into the garden, and he lay down under his favorite apple tree. And he fell asleep. And Frankie did it again. that made me so angry. You know, you should never take stuff personally with children. You really shouldn't. If you're working with a kid, or even if you're a parent, or an aunt or an uncle or a babysitter, you can't take it personally. They're only 8. They're innocent. But I was so pissed off. I stopped my story and I went right over to little Frankie, and I looked at him in his little impudent brown eyes, and I said, "Hey, I'm from Detroit, okay? So, you do that one more time, I'm going to kick you out of my cabin." I gave him the look. So he's nodding, yeah. Well, if there's one thing you should never tell a kid like Frankie, it's "if you do this one more time." It's the dumbest thing you could ever say. So I went back to the story. The third son, the third prince, he went off to the garden, and he went under his favorite apple tree, and he fell asleep, and he had a dream. And in his dream, he heard a voice. And the voice said, and he did it again. And I lost it. I'm sorry, I lost it. I'm not proud of this, but I was mad. And this was my debut performance, and he wrecked it. So I went over to his bunk, and I picked him up by his pajamas, and I took him to the door of the cabin, and I said, that was it, goodbye. I threw him out into the night. I locked the door, and I continued telling the story, and the boys listened really well. But it was hard to tell it because Frankie kept banging on the door, yelling, "Old man Bolton's going to get me." I said, "Good, yeah, chop you." But he missed the story. And it's a beautiful story because the third son does hear the voice in the dream that tells him what to do, to go on the quest, and he finds the fairy Firebird, and she cures his father's blindness, and he becomes the king, and the story ends as they found their heart's desire. May you find yours. And only at the end of the story did another kid, he finally gets out of the bunk, he lets Frankie in. Frankie never heard the story. And I want to say one thing that I never knew then. I knew many, many years later. And a lot of the stories that are told at MoMondays bring you to some learning, a bit of wisdom maybe, that you get from your life experience. And this was something that I learned many years later. I thought about it a lot, but not at the time. Frankie is the hero of every fairy tale ever told. That's what the old stories tell you. Is that kid who's in the office every day, has 3 social workers, 2 psychiatrists, and by now probably a parole officer or 2. That kid is the hero. If you see the quality of a hero in that child, he or she will become that hero. And what Frankie was trying to tell me is, hey, Mr. Storyteller, those are just pretty words you're saying. But you don't know the first thing about the story, and that is that I am the hero of your story. And he said it Frankie style. That's the best he could do at 8 years old. And I reacted as I did. But after that summer, I went ahead and I tried to find every folk tale I could. I learned them whenever I found one I liked. And I traveled around telling stories like that, like many of you do in your various jobs and personal lives and so on. But deep inside is always the feeling that I'm telling it for Frankie because I owe that boy a fairy tale. Thanks for listening.